Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. My role is a little different this morning. I'm going to act as a commentator. That's not all that different, but a commentator on the remarks that you just heard from Secretary Spellings and Governor Romer. Because, in fact, I think the Aspen Institute realizes that journalists are taught to be quick. In the spirit of education, let me say that we once had an intern at the Washington Post where I used to work, and he was asked to do an obituary on deadline. And he went off to his computer and started tapping away, and pretty soon the red light turned on my computer to indicate there was a story waiting. And when I looked to see how quickly he had done it, the story read something like, John Jones looked up the open shaft to see if the elevator was coming. It was, age 42. So I don't know if I can be that quick, but I'm going to try to be quick because we've got a terrific panel coming out here, including Tom Donahue and Joel Klein, to join Governor Romer and Secretary Spellings. I wanted to emphasize one thing that stood out to me in listening to Governor Romer and Secretary Spellings. Secretary Spellings talked about the concept of our children. Exactly who are our children? Governor Romer talked about the whole dubious value of today's high school diploma given the high rate of remediation that we see called for in American education, as well as the need for states to get involved. You have a strong sense there that there is a separate class, and I might add a separate race of people being disproportionately impacted by this conversation that we're having today. What I mean by that is if you look at the numbers, what you'll realize is that black and brown children are the ones who are at the losing end of the dropout rate, the achievement gap. They're the ones who are not going to college, and if they are going to college, too often not graduating from college. They are disproportionately absent from our graduate schools and professional schools. This is an ongoing crisis in our midst. It is, to my mind, the civil rights issue of the 21st century. To my mind, it is the political issue of the 21st century. You can hear that clearly in Governor Romer's and Secretary Spellings' remarks, but I think it is very difficult for them, speaking as white Americans, to say it in an explicit way that there needs to be a roaring voice in this country that says explicitly, we are on the verge of an increased class and racial divide unless we deal quite directly with this as a civil rights and political issue. And yet, our political leaders are very leery of dealing with it in such explicit terms. I find it tremendously frustrating to watch this political campaign and see how slow the politicians, especially the two candidates, have been to come to the idea of the need to challenge unions, how slow they have been to come to the idea that in fact there is a groundswell calling for better options for minority parents seeking to gain an adequate education for their children. There simply isn't that willingness to say, we have a problem here and we must deal with it. We're now more than 50 years after Brown v. Board of Education. And I wrote a book about the man who was the lead counsel in that case, Thurgood Marshall. And I remember going up to visit Thurgood Marshall for one of my interviews, and in the course of it, I said to him, you know, Justice Marshall, I just read a piece in a law review, a Howard University law review, that said you made critical mistakes back in 1954 by making this case about racial integration, that you should have focused on quality schools for all children without regard to their race. And that if you had done that, you would have saved us all the problems that come with discussions of race in American society. Instead, it could have been a simple and direct focus on making sure that children, no matter if they were going to a school that was all black or all white, had the very best in the way of education. I mentioned to him that the federal courts around the country were undoing all sorts of desegregation orders, busing orders and the like. I'd been out to Oklahoma City and visited parents who were arguing against the NAACP trying to retain busing in their community. And I said, you know, many people think, in fact, that somehow that era of Brown acts now to delay or impede changes in our education system by continuing this focus on race. I remember Justice Marshall looking at me like I was a man who had missed out on a lot of history education myself. He looked at me and basically said, you know, he wasn't trying to create some Norman Rockwell picture of America with black kids next to white kids, next to Hispanic kids and Asian kids, but he pointed out the politics of the era and said you had all white school boards and white political structures that were denying equal funding to schools for minority kids. And unless there was the threat of integration, that the black child would have the right to attend the same school as the white child, there was no way to assure that those white politicians and white school boards would invest the necessary funds to produce an equal educational opportunity for minority children. Well, I remember walking away from that conversation, going down those white marble steps of the Supreme Court and thinking to myself, my gosh, I'm in the District of Columbia. Look around. Look at the hyper-segregation that exists in this city in terms of public schools. Look at the donut effect. Look at the high rate of achievement in terms of the Washington area suburbs, Fairfax County, Montgomery County, almost exclusively among white children. Obviously, you have immigrants and the like, but in terms of the white-black dynamic, almost exclusively among those white children. Look at the differentiation here, and yet the discussion that Thurgood Marshall had 50 years ago holds today, in that there's a political aspect to maintaining jobs, maintaining patronage, opportunity, but very little in the way of moving away from that dynamic and saying that the politics of this era calls for attention to the failing of the school system, even for all of its attention to diversity and the like, the failure of the school system to deliver on that quality education. To me, this is the civil rights issue of our day. And it's ironic that the civil rights leadership of this day, and too many black politicians of this day, minority politicians in general, refuse to deal with this issue, refuse to acknowledge it as the critical issue that it is across the board in terms of everything from high unemployment rates, high poverty rates, high incarceration rates that can be directly linked to what's going on in the schools. There are some who would make excuses because of the high rate of family breakdown in the minority communities in our country today, point out the number of children born out of wedlock, number of children who don't have someone to read to them at home in the early stages, and the consequence that has before they set foot in school for the first day. But there's no excuse, it seems to me, for all of us, without regard to our race or class, to abandon children, in specific poor and minority children, without understanding that we are damaging not only those children, we are damaging our country and we are damaging race relations. That there is an opportunity here to be a voice for children who don't have a voice in terms of a vote, in terms of financial contributions, don't have a voice in American society. Let me just quickly end with this thought. In writing about Thurgood Marshall, remember that he went down south with the man who was his law school dean, a man named Charles Hamilton Houston, to look at the disparate conditions of schools for black and white children. And what he found, of course, that there were school facilities, laboratories, gymnasiums, buses, and the like for the white children, not available for the black children. And at one point, he was standing in front of a school that was not a building, it was nothing but a shack, tar paper pulled over the top, no carpeting like we have here today, but simply a dirt floor that would become thick with mud as the rains came. And he is looking at this and standing outside by his car eating a sandwich, and a little boy wanders along and he says to the little boy, "What do you want?" And the boy doesn't respond but points to an orange that Thurgood Marshall had. And Marshall takes it and gives it to him, and the boy just stares at it and he says, "Go ahead, eat it." So finally, The boy bites at it, but he bites at it right through the rind, and Marshall says, "What the hell is wrong with you? You're crazy? You don't bite through." And then the kid smushes the orange all over his face. Some of it gets into his eye. He takes it and flings it on the ground. Young Thurgood Marshall, just out of law school, goes ballistic. "What the hell is wrong? You crazy kid." And of course, his dean then comes running and says, "What are you doing screaming at this kid?" And Thurgood Marshall says, "Dean, you don't understand. This kid bit at my orange right through it like the rind, like he's a crazy person. Now he's thrown it on the ground. He's got it all over his face, got it in his eyes." Dean Houston looked at him and said, "You don't understand. I may have signed your law degree, but you know, we don't see any factories or office buildings in this rural community. That's because the people here, they're lucky if they can get the man in the big house to give them some work as a sharecropper. If someone's kind enough to invite us into their home at night, and we ask to go to the bathroom, they send us to an outhouse with troughs right there filled with human waste. And you're going to stand here and you're going to scream at this kid. This kid doesn't even go to school. This is all his family has to offer the next generation. You're screaming at this kid because he's bitten through an orange rind." He says, "Thurgood, this kid doesn't even know what an orange is. And you're doing nothing but embarrassing me and humiliating this child." And Thurgood Marshall wrote home to his mother. He said, "Mom, you know, the law school dean told me that a lawyer who's not a social engineer is nothing but a social parasite. And today I met a kid who wasn't in school, didn't even know what an orange was. And it occurred to me somebody should be a voice for this child in American society." Well, here we are in 2008. And in fact, we have lots of people who are voices for teachers and administrators and people who build schools and people who are school janitors. But it seems to me there's a crying moral obligation that all of us in this room, recognizing the crisis in American education, acknowledge its racial component, acknowledge the imperative of dealing with this issue before it becomes simply one that divides us beyond repair, that we as conscious, caring souls must do more with regard to this issue with a degree of urgency, or generations to come will say that we took our eyes off the prize. Thank you very much.